Hello, hello. Welcome to One Wild World, a podcast by The Echo. I'm your host, Matthew Juneau.
And I'm the editor, Mike Davis.
Mike, I like to think of myself as an optimist.
Yeah, I'd definitely say that you're an optimistic person. That's pretty accurate.
Yeah, I like to try to find the silver lining in things. But I'll admit that the last few years have really presented a good challenge with that skill. Though, with all the chaos and isolation that COVID caused, I did happen to notice a lot of people respond in a healthy way despite the circumstances.
Yeah, me too. What did you notice most?
Well, during the initial lockdown, when people were going stir crazy in their homes, I noticed a great influx, or should I say outflux, of people either going on walks or hikes or just spending more quality time outside.
That's true. I knew many people that decided to hike and camp way more often, or even just took longer and more frequent walks to the park with their dogs.
And I was totally one of those people. I think that seeing all this new appreciation for trails, parks, and natural areas is one of those silver linings that I was talking about. Lockdown provided a sense of urgency for more people to finally start using these spaces or using them more often to get a breath of fresh air, some exercise, or even to see some local wildlife. As a matter of fact, this is finally how I got into birding and waterfowl identification.
That's cool. And not to mention all the people that started to get into biking and water sports. I remember hearing that outdoor stores were sold out on back order of mountain bikes, kayaks, and other outdoor gear due to the high demand.
Plus, once some restrictions started to lift, I know the national parks saw a huge uptick in visitation. It makes me really happy that people are starting to visit these places. Today's guest actually works in natural areas. She's going to share her perspective about the importance of natural areas and the work of other people like her. But first, we need to take a moment to play one of my favorite games.
What's that animal?
I'm going to be honest. This animal sound was not what I would have expected at first, but that's part of the fun. Some animals can just be surprising in the sounds they make. So here's the sound for the first time. This round is definitely a tricky one, and I'm excited to hear what you all guess for this one. One more time, here's the sound. Once you hear about a few of the animals that our guest works with, I think you might have an easier time deducing what this sound is. So, make sure to stay tuned to the end of the episode to find out the answer to today's mystery. Today, we have an enlightening conversation with our guest, Alyssa Armbruster. She's a resource management technician at City of Fort Collins Natural Areas. Let's head over to my conversation with her now. I'm hoping you can tell me a little bit more about City of Fort Collins Natural Areas, what you do with them, and how you got started working there.
So the City of Fort Collins Natural Areas manages all of the open space or green spaces within the city. And then we also have a few regional properties around the city. So we have Bobcat Ridge Natural Area, which is up in the foothills, and Gateway Natural Area in the foothills. And then we have Soapstone Prairie Natural Area, which is part of a bigger Plains to Foothills project that is where I spend most of my time, is up at Soapstone Prairie. And it's also a 22,000 acre working ranch. So we have a lot of ranch partnerships and cattle up there actively grazing. And we have a bison herd up there that's grazing on part of the pastures. So it's a really interesting property that I feel very fortunate to work on. I got started at the city about 5 years ago. So I moved from Wisconsin to Fort Collins for a 10-month seasonal position. And then after the seasonal position ended, there was a full-time opportunity that opened. So I went through the application process for that and was lucky enough to get the position, which kind of turned into my dream job because it wasn't advertised as a wildlife position. And of course, that's what I was hoping for. And that's now what it's turned into.
Yeah, the wildlife positions tend to get a lot of attention when they do get posted. So that's kind of fun. Maybe it wasn't originally marketed that way, but it ended up turning that way.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like I snuck into a wildlife biologist job.
Yeah. What made you want to work with wildlife? Was there something that as you were a kid that inspired you to work with wildlife or?
Yeah, definitely. Well, growing up in Wisconsin, I was just immersed in the forests and all of the lakes and waterways we have there. My grandpa did backyard birding. I like to say that he was a wildlife biologist as a hobby. He grew up on a dairy farm, but he was really immersed in wildlife and taught me everything about plants and birds and foraging mushrooms, all the sorts of fun natural resource things. So I think growing up in that environment, I knew I one day would go into natural resources and work with animals. And so when I went to college to University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, I focused on environmental science in general and then just volunteered as much as I could doing wildlife work. And it's now helped me get a wildlife position out here in Colorado.
Excellent. I think it's always really interesting to hear the different journeys that people take to get to these jobs because there's general themes that will help you get into wildlife jobs, but everyone's journey looks completely different. And some people end up there by accident. Some people end up there as a very deliberate plan, but it's really interesting to hear.
Yeah, totally.
So Fort Collins has done a really good job of including natural areas all throughout the city. I remember because I went to college at Colorado State University. Every year I lived sort of in different places, but I was never more than a 5-minute walk from at least a green space and then maybe a 10-minute walk to a natural area. So I think that's something that's been really unique about Fort Collins, and it's a great way of developing the city. Why do you think that having natural areas in urban settings is so important?
Well, I think there's a lot of different important factors to having open spaces or green spaces. There's, of course, the scientific benefits of the heat island effect, where you have very urban areas that all of the natural space has just been covered with development. And then heat gets trapped in there, and there's nothing to filter the carbon dioxide, so you don't have trees in that area. So having these little pockets of green space helps with heat island effect. But then I think it's really important for wildlife to have these smaller spaces of refuge throughout the city. You don't have to go far to get a wildlife experience because, like you said, you have a natural area right down the road. The wildlife don't have to be clustered in one area up in the foothills. They have these spaces that they can come down into town and find food, find water, and find a place for shelter. And I think that's really important. One thing I wanted to mention that I thought of when you were talking about going to school here and having the access is we have a really cool program through the Natural Areas Department called Nature in the City. And their goal is to make nature accessible within a 10-minute walk from everywhere. So not only do we have around 50 natural areas in the city, we also have these smaller programs that are going on. So we partner with church groups and schools that can have small butterfly gardens or pollinator gardens on their property that serve as a smaller natural area or a smaller green space.
Wonderful. Yeah, it's really interesting to be in tune with all of the things that are happening. I know one way that I've always recommended as a good way to just be engaged no matter where you are in your community is to hop on social media and find the local projects, or in this case, the City of Fort Collins Natural Areas social media on Instagram, which is, I think, at FC Natural Areas. It's a great way to find either those events that are happening or photos that are being taken in these natural spaces, or even the themed week like National Invasive Species Week. And I know on the Instagram that some of your work has kind of been showcased with butterfly and bumblebee monitoring. There's a trail camera project that you mentioned happens at the Bobcat Ridge. And then there's also stuff with the black-footed ferret. And so I'm hoping what you can do is take each of those projects and tell me a little bit about them and explain the value of the work that's happening there and why it's important.
Yeah, so our butterfly and bumblebee monitoring project is mainly focused around Bobcat Ridge right now as a post-fire restoration survey, and then up at Soapstone Prairie Natural Areas. So we work with the Colorado Butterfly Monitoring Network, and we worked with them a few years ago and noticed that there was a lack of data in the mountains to plains zone, which is at Soapstone Prairie Natural Area. And not only with the Colorado network, there was also a lack of data within our natural areas department. So I work really closely with our wildlife biologist, and I feel very fortunate because I get to learn a lot from him. So he took me under his wing, talking about butterflies, and we have been conducting butterfly and bumblebee surveys up at Soapstone Prairie for 2 years now. So last year was our first year learning the process and learning how the monitoring protocols work. And this year we've been able to survey almost every single day up at Soapstone. So we're doing a lot of hiking, a lot of butterfly transects, and it's really amazing because we're seeing so many different species and such rich species diversity that we didn't know we had up at Soapstone. And then in the long run, this will help us prepare for any restoration projects. So we know what types of species we should be seeing at Soapstone. And if we're not seeing that, then we know there's some restoration work that needs to be done.
Can you break down for listeners that might not know what a transect is? So when you're going out there to do a butterfly transect, what are you doing? How does that look?
We set up over the winter 8 different transects, which you could just say are pretty much trails or hikes. They're not necessarily on trail. A lot of them are actually off trail, and they're all separated to different habitat types that we have at Soapstone. So we have foothills forest, foothills shrubland, shortgrass prairie, we have riparian zones. We have all these different habitat types at Soapstone, and we want to make sure we're touching each one. So a transect, like I said, it could be a trail, it could be a line on a map that we made that wraps around the forest. And so we go out there in the morning, and there's 2 of us. One person is the scribe and one person is the observer. And in the beginning, we were catching all of the butterflies we would see because we were learning how to identify them and learning different families and their traits. Then the scribe would make note of every species we see, and it takes a GPS point so we know exactly where we found it. And now that we've been just doing this so much, we honestly don't catch a butterfly that often anymore because we're able to identify it in flight, and we know based on flight patterns what species we should be seeing for that time of year, so we can kind of tune into what species to be looking for.
I feel like this is something that I know I ran into when I was studying wildlife and then just doing education and working with animals all the time, is you get so clued into those species that I can hear like a bird chirp off in the distance and immediately my brain just IDs it and like logs it in my head. And so I imagine it's probably the same for butterflies.
Oh, yeah.
Are you recording the scientific name, common name? What kind of things do you look for there?
For butterflies, we're just recording the common names because there's just so many different ones that we could be seeing. For bumblebees, it's a little different. There's only about a dozen bumblebees that we actually get in the Fort Collins area. So we've been able to learn their scientific names and just call them out by that. But our bumblebee surveys are the same process as our butterfly surveys, the same transects, the same protocols where there's a scribe and an observer.
Yeah, I think wildlife biologists are either excellent people to hike with because you're so clued into the natural world, or we're horrible people because we're stopping all the time to look at something or try to take a photo or figure out what species it is.
Oh, yeah. My non-wildlife friends, I think, definitely get sick of me. We were on a river trip earlier this summer, and I was just identifying all of the butterflies, and they're just like, okay, Alyssa, we get it. It's hard to turn it off.
It is, yeah. But with the right crowd, it's always appreciated.
It's a party trick.
Yeah, it is a party trick. It's a good one. Can you tell me about the trail camera project that you're a part of?
Definitely. When I started 5 years ago, this camera project had been going on for 10 years at that point, and it was kind of in a lull. We didn't know. We had cameras up at Bobcat, but nobody was using it for any data. So they asked if I wanted to take the project over. And at that time, it was mainly being used for an education and outreach purpose. So we have volunteers that go out and check the cameras, and that's still the case today. I have a really awesome set of volunteers who I don't even have to worry about the cameras anymore. They just go out and check them for me. But it was mainly an education purpose so that it gets volunteers out learning about trail cameras, learning about wildlife. And then there was also this issue where we have a lot of elk at Bobcat Ridge, and we don't want them over summering there because we only want them there in the winter. If they're there in the summertime and sticking around, they can overgraze the property, and that just is not beneficial for what our goals are for the property. So we put trail cameras up in areas that we know the elk use so that we can make sure we catch any of them that are staying around all summer long. Just recently, we started doing a project with one of our environmental planners with the city. So when the Cameron Peak fire happened in 2020, it burned almost all of Bobcat Ridge Natural Area. So we actually closed the property for almost a year to do trail work and restoration work. And we wanted to see what the difference in wildlife abundance was on trails versus off trails, comparing it pre-fire when it was open and then during the months that the property was closed for restoration, and then once we reopened the property to the public. Our hypothesis is that the wildlife were clearly using trails when nobody was around, and when we reopened it, it pushed them up to higher elevations at Bobcat Ridge, where not a lot of people go up to. They're less populated trails. So we've been collecting data for the last year to monitor that. My role with the trail cameras is really I manage the cameras. I have the supply cache of cameras and the knowledge and expertise, and then anyone can come to me if they have a project they want to use the trail cameras for, and then I help facilitate that. And if we need to get volunteers for that, I have a core group of volunteers who are really well versed in our cameras and know where the remote locations are and can go check them and swap batteries and memory cards for me.
Trail cameras are such a unique way that everyday people can get involved in wildlife. I know there's a bunch of different outdoor stores that will sell trail cameras, and they range from pretty easily approachable to hundreds of dollars. Do you have any tips for if someone was to just go buy a trail camera and set it up, how they might find areas where wildlife's visiting?
Yeah. Well, first of all, you can't just put a trail camera up on public land, but if they have private property that they would like to learn more about their wildlife, I think before you buy the trail camera, just getting to know your property and getting to know the wildlife you would be seeing there. So looking for scat, looking for game trails that they use, looking for tracks in the snow or in the mud. I think that would be the first step so that you know what areas your wildlife are using. And then if you go and buy a trail camera at any store, like you mentioned, the basic ones really do the trick. If you're just looking for a general understanding of what you have on your property, then you know where to put your cameras generally, and you can always move them. So if you see a game trail, notice a lot of scat, you could put a camera up there. And then if you go a few weeks without seeing anything on there, then reevaluate and try to pick a new spot. But I think that's what's most fun about it is you get to learn where your wildlife are going, what resources they're using, and how they're using this property that you share.
And I think trail cameras also provide such a unique opportunity because, kind of like you said, when you're going out and doing transects and looking for butterflies and bumblebees, you're only able to witness the ones that are there or the evidence that's there during the time you're doing that transect. But a trail camera is operating the entire time, like 24/7. Is there a best photo that's come out from this project and then a weirdest photo that's come up?
So most recently, the first one I think of is we have one off-trail camera that we always get bears at Bobcat Ridge, and there is this little bear cub that has been hanging out on this rock. I think it's actually posted on our social media a few weeks ago. I haven't been out to investigate more, but there must be something in the tree right by the rock because this bear cub comes back almost every day and is crawling up into the tree. And I don't know if he's eating something or what, but that's been my most fun experience lately is getting the pictures from that bear cub. The weirdest one, I wouldn't say it's weird necessarily, but just something that took me off guard is we get a lot of photos of elk and mule deer just grazing together, which I suppose looking back at that makes sense, but that's just not what I was expecting to see. When I'm looking at the photos, I'm counting how many elk are in the photo, or I'm counting how many bears are in the photo. And then when you see different species commingling, that's a really cool experience.
That is surprising to hear that they just hang out.
I know. I just wasn't expecting that.
Yeah, in my head, they seem like cousins. So that kind of makes sense of like, it's a little family reunion.
Yeah, so it makes sense. They get together every once in a while.
I know trail cameras have just captured some really unique things. I think a while ago, there was a coyote and a badger that were like hanging out together. That's kind of what made me think of that. And there's just some really interesting things that trail cameras are able to capture.
I think one thing as well is When you think of Soapstone Prairie or the shortgrass prairie in general, you don't really think of bears being up there. And we've had trail cameras more so into the shortgrass prairie that have caught bears just roaming around on the prairie. And again, it just takes you off guard. You wouldn't expect to see that there. But yeah, we've seen photos of the badger coyote duo out near Soapstone as well. So that's a really cool experience.
Yeah. And then finally, can you tell me a little bit about the black-footed ferret monitoring that you're a part of?
So black-footed parrots were twice believed to be extinct. And then in the 80s, they were found at a ranch up in Meeteetse, Wyoming. So a ranch dog came back with a dead, weird-looking thing, and the rancher thought it was just a weasel, brought it to a taxidermist, and turns out it was the extinct black-footed ferret. Since then, there's been a big conservation effort to bring them back to the prairie and return them to the prairie. So the City of Fort Collins Natural Areas works really closely with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife. We actually have the Black-footed Ferret Recovery Center is just off of I-25 near Cheyenne, and it's on city property, so we get to work very closely with the recovery efforts. So in order for there to be a successful black-footed ferret population, there needs to be a healthy prairie dog population. But the prairie dogs are susceptible to the sylvatic plague from the fleas that are on the rodents. And black-footed ferrets, almost 90% of their diet is made up of prairie dogs. So you need a good prairie dog population for the ferrets to survive. So a lot of my time is spent doing plague mitigation up at Soapstone Prairie. So that's just applying an insecticide onto the burrows so that it kills the fleas that transmit the plague to the prairie dogs that the ferrets eat. So it's a perfect example of a chain of reactions. We do that twice a year. It takes up most of my time, like 4 or 5 months of the year is spent doing plague mitigation. And then in the fall and spring, we do spotlighting efforts. So since the ferrets are nocturnal, they're active at night, they're out feeding on prairie dogs at night, we go out onto our prairie dog colonies with spotlights and spotlight for them. And then if we see a ferret, we drive to the burrow that it was at and we set a trap. It's just like a long rectangular live trap. And then we check that trap every half hour. And once we capture one, we bring it to our vets, which is Aaron Meyer, who's our wildlife biologist that I work with, and myself. We're both trained to put the ferrets under anesthesia and give them vaccines for the sylvatic plague and for distemper. And then we put a little microchip in them so that we can use a reader if we recapture them and see if they're still alive, see if they're a wild born, see if they're a recapture. And then we release them back out to the burrow that we found them in. So it's a really unique and one of a kind experience because you're out at the prairie at night. The shift starts at 7 p.m. and goes until 7 a.m. So you're just driving around with a spotlight all night. And you not only see ferrets, but you're seeing badgers and coyotes and pronghorn and bobcats all just doing their nightly routines. And it's a really cool experience. And then the night sky, of course, up at Soapstone is just beautiful as well.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, being able to see things that not a lot of other people are seeing just by being out there at a time. And the animals probably also learn, okay, these are the high traffic times of the day. And at night, that's when I'm active and there's not as many people.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure you get to see some great things out there.
Yeah, and Soapstone's already a pretty secluded property, so a lot of our raptors that are up there are a little more sensitive to human activity. So whereas here in town you have bald eagles nesting in the middle of town. So we're a little more sensitive to our wildlife up there because we know they're not used to seeing people as often, and then especially people in the middle of the night. So we try to respect that as well. It is amazing to see a bobcat running across the prairie, but we try to give them their space.
Yeah, not just blind them with flashlight.
Yeah, exactly.
The black-footed ferret is a really interesting case of endangered species because, like you said, it was thought to be extinct and then suddenly it popped up on the map and it's been this great recovery project that's been going very successful. And I've kind of stayed tuned in throughout the years and it just seems like the next update that I hear is always a good thing and that things are going well for the ferret. So that's awesome to be part of it.
Yeah, most recently there was one that was cloned, so that was a big success. It's always exciting and it feels like a step in the right direction when we're out spotlighting for them and catch one and it's a wild born, because then we know it wasn't one that we released that was born in captivity, because that would have a pit tag in it. And it wasn't one that we've already captured and pit tagged. That means it was born completely in the wild without the assistance of humans, which is always an exciting find.
Do you know how many there's been that have been wild born?
So we monitor twice in the fall and once in the spring, and each monitoring session is 1 week long. So roughly 3 weeks of monitoring each year. I don't know the number off the top of my head, but I would say we probably on average find maybe 2 or 3 wildborns every session. So that's a pretty good number, I think. There's definitely some years that we don't see any ferrets and it's just a long week of no sleep and spotlighting on the prairie. But there's a lot of different factors that can go into that. The weather, the moon phase, there's many things. I don't think that's a determining factor that they're not out there. I think it's just we picked the wrong week to look for them.
Are there any misconceptions about natural areas or the animals that you work with that you want to break down?
Prairie dogs is obviously a hot topic for everybody, and it's tricky because in town, prairie dogs can be seen as a nuisance, but then up at Soapstone, we need them to have some of our other species survive. I think it all just comes down to communication, and I think we do a great job at communicating, but just talking to people, our spray crew will come across a lot of people who are just upset that we're spraying weeds with chemicals or we're doing XYZ. And I think it all just comes down to communication, because I've had a lot of times where I think a conversation is going to go horrible because of how this person has approached me. But then I find most of the time they just want to talk and get their voice out there and get their voice heard. So if you listen to them and give them advice, that's really all they want. And just keeping a nice, positive communication stream between you and the public is what I've learned has been the biggest issues I've come across.
What do you think is one of the biggest threats that natural areas or animals face in the world right now?
I think just development and the growing communities, especially here in the Front Range. Everyone, myself included, wants to move to Colorado, so they do. And we take up a lot of space, and we're taking up space from wildlife that were here first and deserve to be here. So I think that's our biggest issue and our biggest threat. The city does a great job at preserving open spaces and buying properties that will one day have trails on them, and it saves that from being developed. It's tricky because you need to provide housing for people and you need to provide affordable housing, but we also need to preserve these open spaces so that they're here for us in the long run.
How about, do you have anything that people in their everyday lives, even if they're not in Fort Collins, can do to either support or protect natural spaces because they are so important?
Yeah, I think just getting involved with your community is number one thing for me. Like I had mentioned before, I didn't have any wildlife like courses in college, and I just got involved with my community. There's a lot of wildlife monitoring programs that are community science programs, so anyone could go out and be trained on how to identify butterflies and bees, can go out and learn how to check trail cameras. And I think people won't fight for these open spaces and fight for protecting them unless they have a meaningful tie to them. So if they can get involved, if anyone can get involved in their community, whether that be actually getting out in the field or just attending community forums or talking to city representatives, that will give them a reason to fight for keeping these spaces safe and protected.
Excellent. And kind of like we said, the Fort Collins Instagram or the website's just a great way to learn about upcoming events so that, yeah, people can be part of those community science projects and learn how to ID butterflies. And then you too can also be either annoying or really helpful on hikes next time you see insects.
Exactly. And you can call yourself a hobby wildlife biologist officially.
There you go. And then finally, what's the best way that people can support City of Fort Collins natural areas?
Like you mentioned, following along on our social media is a great way to learn about events, and that in turn just supports what we're doing and keeps these programs going. So if we have people showing up to these events, we'll just be encouraged to have more of them. Getting involved with programs is number one, and reaching out and talking to anyone from the Natural Areas Department about anything from job shadowing to just a conversation on the phone, because I love talking to people about what I do, and I know everyone in my department feels the same way. So if people want to support us, just talking to us and communicating with us and getting involved with some of our programs.
The other thing that I'd probably add on, not only just Fort Collins natural areas, but with any natural areas, is just getting out there and exploring them. And just by going out and visiting them, you'll gain this appreciation for having them there. And then when time comes around to either protect those places or advocate for them, that's what really counts, is having as many people on board.
Yeah.
The other thing that I like to add on is things that people can do in their everyday life is when you do visit these natural places, I always think of it as like a price to ride. So looking for one little piece of just micro trash or something that you can take and put in your pocket or in your backpack. And if everyone, instead of leaving a piece of trash, picked up a piece of trash, these natural areas are just going to be beautiful and continue to be what we want them to be for years to come. So
yeah. We actually have a few programs within the city where people can get involved with being sort of adopters of natural areas. So you could be an official adopter and go out once every 2 weeks and pick up trash. We have volunteer ranger assistants. So you could be trained to be a volunteer ranger, go out on the natural areas and do some small patrols. And it's mainly just educating folks about the natural areas and what you can do to protect them and how to keep them safe. And then we have master naturalists who help us with educational programs. So there's a lot of really cool opportunities to get involved with our specific natural areas. And I know for sure along the Front Range, our open space programs are pretty elite. So I'm sure other organizations have just as great programs.
awesome. Well, Alyssa, this was a great conversation. Thank you for taking the time and talking today.
Thank you so much.
It makes me so happy to have such passionate people like Alyssa working to take care of these places and maintain them for everyone to get in touch with nature and wildlife. I was lucky to always have an appreciation for natural areas growing up in Colorado where there's so many options. So whether it's a natural area, a neighborhood park, or even just your backyard, make sure you're taking advantage of the outdoor spaces near you. I'm now prepared to offer all you listeners one more chance to hear our mystery animal before I reveal the answer. Here's that sound. You've just heard the chattering of the black-footed ferret, which used to be quite common in the western US. Their populations diminished heavily because of human activity, but with effective conservation efforts, they've experienced a bit of a comeback. There's still much work to do for them, but it's good to celebrate the success we've seen so far. In wildlife biology, we're always happy to have examples of bringing animals back from near extinction, and it's heartwarming to add this member of the weasel family to that list. In my research for this sound, I discovered that black-footed ferrets are actually pretty vocal animals, making chatters, whimpers, hisses, and even a noise called a chortle. You learn something new every day. Well, we've reached the end of this round, but tune in next time for another chance to play
What's that animal?
If you enjoyed this conversation, subscribe and consider supporting us directly at patreon.com/onewildpodcast. Here, you'll find exclusive content, like the full video versions of our conversations. To find out more about the other work we do, visit our website at onewildpodcast.com. Follow us on Instagram at @theechoanimals, and follow our TikTok at creature.feature. On behalf of all animals, thank you for listening.